Ready. Cool. Inviting Buzz up now. So I'm super excited to hear the stories today from Buzz. I was sort of scrolling through Twitter and found Buzz made a little tweet around like Figma and a design system, and this is just this tiny little detail that I was really excited about. And then I saw about a week later, I checked back in on that same tweet, and there was about 50 comment thread, a Twitter storm going on, and I thought, okay, we need to hear this story. So, welcome, Buzz.
Hey, can you see and hear me okay?
We can indeed.
I like how that picture was me with hair. This is pre-COVID isolation haircut.
Awesome.
Well, I should crack into it. This is truly terrifying. I'm used to doing sort of in-person meetups, so this is definitely my first virtual meetup. So, hey everyone, there's like 157 people here, which is truly terrifying. Yeah, so basically I'm just going to talk through the story of our design systems, kind of based loosely off that tweet that Chan mentioned. And then jump into a bit of a demo, which again is a first for me. So I'm just gonna be like fingering around Figma, trying to figure out what I'm doing. And then we'll do a bit of Q&A. So I'll just smash through this. So I'm hoping I can share my screen and it won't go all to shit. So Chan, can you see the screen?
Yes, I can. We'll just make that the main screen there. Beauty, there you go.
Here we go.
Take it away.
So I'm Buzz, as Chan mentioned. I have been working in software for 10 years now. Been in Australia for about 10 years now as well. So I've worked for a lot of different companies, different sizes, different challenges. But I think the common theme, sort of as was mentioned, is that I've kind of been in this sort of the bridge between design and engineering. Whether it be at agencies, which is where I was before software, or at these software companies. And I've kind of learned a lot as I've gone through, working for companies like Skype, running teams at Campaign Monitor, obviously observing the amazing systems that they have at Atlassian. Kind of like, pulled all that together into where I am today, which is Help Scout. So Help Scout is a US-based customer support software, and we are 100% remote. Which isn't exactly novel to anyone now, but it was novel to me when I started. So I've been there for about 3.5 years, and we're a team of about 100 people, but only 8 designers really. So I'll touch on that in a bit because that's quite important. And I'm the principal designer, which sounds really grand, but it just means that I am kind of charged with helping other designers achieve success in their own roles by creating tools and processes and that kind of stuff. Which it happens I'm really interested in. So yeah, I want to stress that we're like a really small team. So I think this is kind of like the theme of this talk for me, is that we don't have lots and lots of designers, at our disposal. We certainly don't have a centralized office. And so because we are across borders and I'm the only person in this hemisphere, documentation, processes, that's really important for Help Scout. So I'm just going to focus on the product side of things today. We have another 4 designers who are on the brand side, who are equally distributed. But there are 4 of us, and we are split into 4 cross-functional teams. Each team looks at a different area of the business. So I work with 2 UI engineers, and we look at the communication side of Help Scout, which is emails, chat, messages, that kind of stuff. The Irish designer works for the mobile stuff. So whilst we all sort of share design tools and sort of the collaboration and communication stuff that you expect, the parts of the product we're focused on is very separate. But I think more than anything, we're busy. Like, we're really busy, and we got stuff to do, and everything's always on fire. We've got our own issues. So I think what is probably most familiar with a lot of companies of our sort of size is that we're kind of fine. And this was certainly the case before we had a design system. It's not that we weren't interested in design systems or sort of good DesignOps type processes. It was that, we were fine in the mess that we were in. And so my job as principal is to make sure that we are at a point of success before the house burns down. And so that's kind of what I'm talking about today, which is design systems for teams who don't have time for design systems. And so again, I'm just going to focus on the product design side of things. I'm just going to sort of talk about kind of where we are today, how we got here in about 20 minutes. And then I'm going to go into Figma. I'm going to show you some stuff, and then we'll do a Q&A. Basically, super happy to answer anything, be totally transparent. I love anything that sort of breaks the myth that companies know what they're doing. I certainly have no idea. So this has all sort of been learned as I go. And yeah, so it kind of all started with us in a very familiar way, I think. So pre having a design system, we had a ginormous sketch file. So this is probably the same as like most of you here. And whilst the designers were pulling UI from this one file, it was just literally a file that was exactly like this. So we shared some UI, and so any sort of new feature or product or whatever, someone would go in here, grab a pie chart, put it into their sketch doc, and that was as collaborative as we got. And then when it went onto the front end side of things, they had, to be fair, a bit more of a process. They had this framework called Seed, and they implemented, you know, their version of the front end. So it kind of worked, and the product is like 12, 13 years old now. And so it worked for like 10 years like this. But more recently, as we've scaled the business, scaled the team, we did things like a brand refresh where we updated the color blue on every page. And we realized that there was no consistency, there was no shared standards. So we had to update this color blue like 200 separate times. And so that was kind of the first highlight of a real big problem that we had, that we needed to kind of find some kind of system to like componentize stuff. And then I got the opportunity to redesign this old fusty looking screen, which was 12 years old. And so I kind of use this as an opportunity to design some components, basically, on the design side of things that we could share amongst our design files, have what I thought was a sort of a design system. And so I took this, I created some like more modern components. I tried to start a UI library, involved all the designers, everyone was super excited. And then we launched that, and that former page you saw ends up looking like this. And everyone was stoked, and I was really happy. And I was like, yeah, we're killing it. You know, like this is DesignOps. But the problem was that the next team that kind of got to this, they implemented those designs in another section, in another team, and it looked like this. And I remember looking at this being like, it's like looking at an uncanny valley type thing. Like it was kind of right, but it was also kind of not right. Like the inputs were slightly weird, the buttons were a different color. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized there was just like stuff wrong everywhere. And it turned out that there was no componentization of that. It basically, all that we'd done is exactly the same as we'd always done, which was we'd taken old UI, put it on the web, and just kind of hope for the best. And so roughly around midnight, I had enough. And so I kind of, this was, I don't know why I found this, but I looked through Slack and I found the moment that I'd sort of, something flipped in my head, and I organized a group meeting with most of the UI engineers and the front enders and the designers to kind of figure out how we could solve this moving forward. And I think what I realized at this point was that a design library is not a design system, and that's obvious to most of you, I'm sure. But I figured that we may as well give it a shot. And so that's kind of what this is based on today. And so we had that discussion in October 2018, and about a year later, we had full company buy-in. We have a system that works pretty robustly. And so I'm going to talk today about how we got there. And there is basically a design system called HSDS, which is the least imaginative name ever, the Help Scout design system. And it's 7 UI libraries that has about 1,500 components in all of it. It's all kind of interdependent. We also have almost complete code parity as well. So this is something that I'll sort of talk about in a bit more detail in the demo. But this is Storybook, where we keep all of our React components. We have Figma embedded in that. So we have like a good parity in development pipeline. And also, really importantly, we have company buy-in. So this was the Slack channel today. And there's 26 people in this Slack channel, which doesn't sound that interesting or that big, but 26 out of a 100-person company is a big chunk of people who are invested in something which isn't all that sexy. So I'm really pleased about that. And that's kind of happened in the last year or so. The thing that I wanted to focus on is kind of giving some tips to anybody who's trying to build out their design systems at a company that doesn't necessarily give them the teams or the resource or the time to create their own design systems, and how we did it and how I kind of made a lot of mistakes in getting here. So there's kind of 3 core things that I wanted to touch on today. And the first of those is build together. And this, I mean, all of these sound really obvious, but this is really important, I think, because there's that whole quote about, like, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And that really applies for a design system, because as Chan said, you know, like it's as much engineering as it is design. And I think calling it a design system does a disservice because it kind of puts engineers on the back foot a bit. So what I really wanted to do was make it feel like something that we were building together. And a big part of that was that initial meeting to rally everybody around a common pain, which was that we were just creating the same code over and over and over again. And nobody wanted that, least of all the engineers. And so the first thing that we did when creating this was use the tools the engineers used. And this pains me because, you know, I'm not a huge Jira fan. But getting their investment was like the top priority. So we used the tools that they did. We integrated with their workflow. We created HSDS Jira boards, and, you know, created tasks and whatnot. And that was really important because engineers could then integrate into their workflow, you know, the stuff that we were trying to do. And again, because we didn't really have permission from the company to spend heaps of time doing this, engineers could kind of like dip into it as they wanted, rather than having this sort of big, you know, dark cloud of a design system that they had to sort of achieve. We also have this, you know, GitHub PR situation. I don't know too much about how the engineers work, to be honest, but we integrated into their workflow. But I think what was a really cool output of that was that they started suggesting useful stuff that, you know, was based off of what they, solutions they thought would be useful for us. So one of the things was this command line tool called Colorway, where basically you put in a hex value and it will spit out the design system code for it. So like in this case, charcoal 400. So this doesn't sound particularly interesting or useful, but I use this like 20 times a day, every single day. And so having an engineer come up and be like, hey, I built this thing for you, was like a real sort of nudge that we were doing the right thing. It was a real payoff. And also you can see the designers were particularly interested in this as well. This was a meeting where we were discussing whether to break the libraries into separate libraries in Figma or have one big library. Super dull stuff, but everything was sort of democratized so that everybody felt some ownership. Everyone could feel the pain, and they could kind of also have some input as well. And I think that was really important. Ultimately, and I think this needs to be mentioned as well, is that as a small team and as sort of like a personal initiative, I ended up having to do most of the legwork. You know, we discussed stuff as a team. We made decisions. I, you know, hosted the meetings. But ultimately, when we'd made those decisions, it kind of comes down to 1 or 2 people to implement them. And so I had an engineer on the engineering side of things. He was building the components and sort of some of the processes. I was building the Figma stuff on our side. But yeah, it was all down to collaboration and sort of like doing things as a team. And the next big part, and this definitely came from Atlassian. So if you know anything about Atlassian, it's that they love rules and processes, and I love them for that. And principles is like one of the main things that they taught to me whilst I was there. And principles were kind of like these defining traits of the design you're creating or the system that you're building. And for me, principles were a really, really good and useful concept, because when you're creating a design system, you're basically just staring into the void screaming. So this is me for the last year and a half. And so our principles, there's 3 of them. The first one, this is a real guiding thing for how I would suggest small companies build their design systems, but this has been a real game changer for us, is that I saw a talk once from Minna Markham, who did the design systems for Hillary Clinton. She works at Slack, very smart. She said that a design system is a set of rules, and rules and creativity aren't mutually exclusive. Rules are meant to be broken. And I think that spoke to like one of the main misconceptions that our CEO had, at least when he heard about this design system, was it seemed to him like we were going to be creating components and rules that were going to limit creativity, that designers weren't allowed to create stuff that they thought was the best response to a user problem, that they were instead going to be like limited to a grid system and, you know, certain blocks and components. So we didn't want that. And I certainly didn't want to create a design system that stopped people from creating the best UI that they thought was possible. The second I kind of spoke to already is that it needs to be based in code. And this is to kind of prevent that settings drama from happening before. If it's not coded, it's not real. You know, there's a lot of design systems that are purely just hypothetical in the sense that they just live in Figma and they don't live in code. So everything we did had to have some code element to it. And the third and final principle was that we needed to design and build a system that enabled everybody to contribute to it without becoming this huge mess. And I think this is kind of the big difference between bootstrapping a design system as a small company and having a design systems team, is that we don't really have this ivory tower or approvals process. So at big companies, obviously you have like a designer would say, I want this new component. They would pitch it. The team would sort of figure out whether that was right to build. They would build it. It would be this whole process. We didn't have the time or the appetite to do that, and so the system itself needed to mirror the team that was using it. And finally, be imperfect. So the more I thought about building a small design system for a small company, the more I realized that we'd made like a bunch of mistakes along the way. And I think that's okay. And I think that's one of the main things about being small, is that you can embrace that size, and you can be lean, and you can make mistakes, and you can move fast. And we certainly did that. And when I sent a tweet out asking what people want to know, people seem really invested in hearing about my mistakes. So I'm gonna talk about some of my mistakes because they kind of informed what you're gonna see in the demo. So the first mistake that I made was this highly suspicious analogy of Duplo being better than Lego. And this is kind of loosely based off of that Brad Frost atomic design principles, where you have particles and you have organisms. And I really didn't want a system full of like these tiny fragment UIs, like little dots and buttons and icons and stuff. I wanted things that couldn't be misconstrued. And I thought that was like this real smart thing that I'd come up with. And so when we started designing HSDS, I started designing these like single-use components, kind of like Duplo, in the sense that if you create a tree or something in Duplo, there's only like 3 blocks and it can only make a tree. Whereas in Lego, there's like 47 blocks and they can make like infinite anythings. So I was like, yeah, we'll make these components. But it was great, but it also, it wasn't good to that first principle, that people couldn't mess with this. They couldn't interpret it in their own way. They could only just produce this chat list. And so we ended up going down a different direction with some things by creating these fairly foundational components like what we have here, where you can use this card with the check mark in the corner in a bunch of different ways. And this definitely helps because it enables designers to kind of interpret stuff as they want to. It makes things a bit looser and a bit scarier. So this kind of approach would scare, I think, big design system teams, but this really works for us. So sometimes components have opinions, sometimes they won't. That was definitely the first thing that I learned. The second mistake was that we don't need components for every interaction state. So I'd seen these design systems where they had like, 1,000 buttons, and I definitely didn't want that. I thought we could get around that by just having one button. I was, so ambitious, and I thought this would be great because designers can just jump in, they can resize it, they can make it green if they want to. Problem solved. The problem is that that was way harder than actually what we have now, which is kind of a midway between the two, where we have lots of states, but designers don't need to just remember things. Like for a disabled button, is it blue 500? Is it gray 500? Is it some sort of opacity? So now they just use that component and there's no mistakes. And I think the big takeaway here, that anything that requires a designer to just remember something, that is a risk, and it kind of introduces that inconsistency. It introduces that sort of divergence. And again, that goes back to the whole settings fiasco. We didn't want that. And the final sort of big mistake that I made was that documentation is something that I'm not really keen on. I feel like it overcomplicates things. So I set out to say, no documentation, we don't need that. So this is me. And it turns out we absolutely do need documentation. And I think that was highlighted by the fact that we had a new designer start halfway through this process called Nikki, and she's a great seasoned designer. She's worked with design systems before, and some of the stuff that she was using, she was like, it makes no sense to me. Stuff that was really obvious to me wasn't obvious to her. And so that was a really good eye-opener to the fact that it's complicated. And so I'm going to touch on how we do documentation in a second. But the punchline of that is that it's complicated. And so sometimes we have documentation on the component, sometimes we have it written out, sometimes we have like web guides, but it needs to be obvious to the designer. And I'll show you some documentation in the demo, which I've actually skipped over a bunch of slides. I was going to talk about how to sell this to the leadership team, and that seems really dull and boring. So I can talk about how we kind of like legitimize this if you're interested in that. But first, I should probably just jump into Figma and show you my desktop. So hopefully you can still see me. Chan, can you validate me here?
Yep, we can see you. Yep, you're all good.
Here we go. All right. So there's three things that I'm going to talk about. There's file setup, because people seem really interested in this, how we do things in Figma. There's the contribution model, like how other designers add stuff, how engineers use it, when things become components, and then also the documentation piece. And I thought I'd use these like really cute little Post-it notes that are also part of our design system. So the first thing is the libraries. So I showed an image of this earlier. So basically we have these 7 libraries, and they are broken down by areas of the products or the code base that have different visual styles. So it wasn't always this way, but this is definitely the best way for us to do this. So product is a fairly big library, but iOS is a separate library, as is the SDK. So basically anything that has totally different visual styles separated. So this is really useful because the brand and the marketing team use their own library that I don't have to mess with. They have their own different avatar sizes, their own inputs and buttons. I don't have to mess with that stuff. But all libraries pull from core. And so core is where we keep things like some of the depth, these like cute sticky notes, the logos. Also, like we've got an illustrator in-house. So we've got all of these like really awesome illustrations that anyone can access. So this is really useful for us because it means we can share assets across the business and then we can keep up to date. So she's been updating this with Pride's illustrations. So we can start pulling from this in the product, which is awesome. And then from the actual product side, within each individual library, we have these fairly well-constructed pages. So this is really important for us. And this is kind of, when Chan mentioned the tweet that I sent, this is kind of like the most interesting thing, I think, for people to see how we name stuff in Figma. So the best component that I can show you is the alert component, because everyone's got this. So basically, each page within Figma, each sort of page, I guess, has a little verified tick if it's got complete code parity. It's got some links along the top. It also has an owner. And then within each one of these, there's the different states. So the things you can achieve with this. And so before, as I mentioned, that first mistake where we didn't have different states, we would just have that one component and you just freestyle it, you change the background and whatever. So we kind of moved away from that. But the really interesting thing for me is the fact that we have this concept of verification. So you'll see within within some of these components, we've got this little blue check. On the left-hand side, we have these kind of categories that also have this check mark. And so this exists within the texts page. And then underneath here, we also have the same categories that don't have the check mark next to it. And what that means is when you go to the panel on the right-hand side, you can see that these things have code parity and these things don't. And so when a component gets built, it can move from not having parity with React to having parity with React without moving libraries or anything like that. And so this level of verification is really useful for the contribution model, which I'll talk about in a sec. Also, when a component is verified and it has that little check mark next to it and it lives within the category that's got the little green emoji, we also have some documentation. So I don't know if you can see in the video well enough, but on the right-hand side, we have this, the code basically, and it shows the name of the component, where you can find it in the storybook, the different properties, the size, that kind of stuff. And this is really useful for engineers because when they go through the different designs that are created using components, they can see exactly where to find that. And in Storybook, it looks like this. And so we have the exact same categories on the left-hand side. See, this is the alert category. And within that, we have the same Figma file that I'm in with the exact same sort of permutations of this. The owner. So there's a lot of cross relationship between Figma and React. And that's really important because when an engineer kind of comes in and they're building something for the first time or they want to know how something works, they can kind of, they know exactly who to talk to. And there's also documentation within each one of these as well. So it has who designed it, the engineer behind it, some of the usage. So some of these components are hyper specific to different areas. Obviously an alert is just wherever. And then the different states and the code behind that. So this is a lot of effort for the engineers to build, but it's definitely worth it because it means that so we have total parity between Storybook and Figma. And so how stuff gets into that verified state is down to how we work at Help Scout. So I mentioned that we are separate teams. So my team is working on this feature here. So this is a feature we just launched called Advanced Permissions. It's about as exciting as it sounds. And most of the feature work that we produce uses existing components. Everything is basically just blocks and form elements. But every so often a designer will come up with a design which uses a new component. And in this case, we created this checkmark card situation here. And so we use this engineering principle called DRY, which stands for don't repeat yourself. So when an engineer takes this, they can see that this isn't a component that exists. And then what they'll do is they will build that component within the environment that they need to, but it's not part of the design system. So at that point, the designer will put the component itself in this non-verified area over here, and there it lives basically forevermore. And so you can see with this, there's like it's related to the radio card component. There's a Jira ticket that relates to the build of this. There's a little prototype as well that I built to kind of show how the hover states and whatnot work. But this can exist here. Forever. So there's no demand for things to always be verified. But then because of this DRY principle, if another part of the product wants to use this symbol, at that point, it becomes part of the design system. So at that point, we create a card in Jira, and this moves over to the verified section. And basically all that means is that there's a corresponding Storybook component, and it's part of the system then. So that means that any designer can use the components they want to. They can also choose to ignore them. And any time that they something goes to production and someone else wants to use that, at that point we clean it up, we add some documentation. But that means that anybody can contribute to this. So that kind of speaks to the first and the third principle, I think, of like creativity first. So you do whatever you want to do. The design system's here to help you if you want to, but you don't feel like you have to be constrained to that. And then also that contribution, like everybody's a contributor. So everybody feels like they can have their say on this. And then when it comes to documenting this thing, so I think this is the real sort of learning curve for me, is trying to make this obvious enough to use and easy enough to use, whilst also giving designers enough freedom to kind of interpret these symbols and these components and patterns how they want. And so we have this general design principle at Help Scale of obvious, easy, possible. So there's this kind of like different levels of usage. So this applies to like the products we create, but also the processes that we have. And so some components are fairly obvious how you use them. So in this case, a card. This is like the Duplo thing. There's no different way to use this. It's got a button. It's got all the layout things you need. It's good to go. So this doesn't really need much documentation. Actually, nothing at all. So when we create this component, we decided it doesn't need docs. There are some things which are easy to use, but have loads and loads of different states and things, like an accordion. So an accordion will have a slightly different documentation. So in this case, we have a Figma file, which lives down here in Figma guides. And we basically explain every different state of this, where you can find it in the app, what happens when it's responsive, different types of accordion. So this one's got a border around it, hover states, different kind of like errors and all that kind of jazz. Basically to stop people from misconstruing this, because whilst it's easy just to give someone that one component, they'll misuse it if it's not really explicit. But the sort of unique thing about this was that these screens here can just be copied. They can be pasted. They're kind of fluid and they work and they're all pinned correctly. And so designers can just go straight in here, copy this, and use it in their documentation. And the possible, there are some things like in core, we have this concept of depth where anything is possible. And so with that, we have this depth guide here. So this is the third and most intense layer of documentation, is where we basically show, we don't tell. So with this, we have, here's how depth works in the app. Here's the different levels of depth you've got. Here's how it's used. Here's some hover states. You can mess with this. So we've built some of these tools that work with React that kind of just give designers like a bit of background on what exists and how they can use it and how they can exploit it, but don't really give too many sort of restrictions. They let people freestyle. And I think finally, before I stop talking endlessly, without any of those things, I think you can have a successful design system. But the one thing that is really important is showing how a design system can be used. So whilst I love like the layout of all of this and the example usage, and there's like hundreds of different symbols and whatnot, it's difficult, even for me as someone who created this, to understand how it should all be used. And so a lot of the documentation we have is literally just all of the screens that we have built using components with dummy content to kind of demonstrate the different variations, different uses, different scenarios and that. Here is an example of how it all works in one of our chat tools. So everything you see here is a component. Everything here has got the little verified tick because all of this is in production and is used elsewhere. And designers can go straight into here. They can copy one of these. They have like all the right content. We make sure we don't use lorem ipsum. We use like diverse avatars. We try and be as useful as we can. So people can kind of go into this, and we have the same for reports. We have the same for some common screens. And I think that's a really nice way of kind of rounding off a design system to say this is exactly how it's being used currently, and you can use this, and you can use this as a starting point, and then you can kind of bounce out from there and do your own thing. And so I think that concludes the demo. I'm sure you've got loads of questions about the ins and outs of how it works, but there we go. That's how we have design tools at Help Scale, and it works for us. I think that's the thing that I kind of want to mention is that this may not be for everyone, but there's a lot of detail that kind of goes in behind the scenes to make this work remotely. There's lots of processes, and I think one of the things for me was I wanted to set out a design system that was scalable as well, that existed beyond my time at Help Scout. I think we've kind of done justice to that.
Wow, that was awesome! Thank you so much. That was really cool. I'm sure everybody's clapping furiously. So many hidden treasures in there. I'll definitely be watching this back and.
Yeah. There's like, I can see that there's like a lot of attention to detail inside the Figma files. Like, yeah, like I definitely have like, a bit of OCD. And so there's definitely that comes through in the files, but it's all very intentional. I think that's kind of one of the perks of working remotely is that you have to be really intentional about how you design stuff, how you communicate stuff, how things are organized and that kind of jazz.
That's so good. Hey, welcome, Tim. I think
I know you.
You had a question there for Buzz.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, man.
Great talk.
Thanks.
I just had a question, around the first principle that you mentioned, which was kind of being able to create and break those guidelines. I, obviously, as you know, I'm from a company from Atlassian, so we are probably one of those companies that have these rules and systems and all of these things in place to almost prevent that. And so I'm wondering how you find that balance or even discern when to break the system versus when to maybe conform to it. Someone's trying to go a bit too rogue or something.
Yeah. So like, I think the what you have at Atlassian is necessary for a team of that size. So like, this wasn't really just throw shade at that. It was more sort of respectful of the fact that this will probably get there one day. But how it works, basically, there has to be an understanding on the engineering side that things will change. And I think that was one of the big learning points for us when we were creating the React components was that I think the engineers were originally looking for rules and structure and it was communicated, I think, at that level that stuff just needs to have properties and overrides and just the assumption that, they're going to be modified in the future. But one of the things that I didn't mention was how we go about sharing stuff as we go. So we have a bunch of rituals in terms of like sharing and communicating our design as we go. And one of those, one big part of that is to go through each other's designs as we go and sort of just give a heads up and be like, oh, you're using a radio here, something custom. I think maybe you should be using this other pattern over here, or maybe an accordion would do this job better than that job over there. But one of the things that I deliberately didn't do in HSDS was a grid system and typography, which is maybe a bit controversial, but I remember using ADG. I think there's an 8-pixel grid there. I think designers became really caught around the axle on everything being 8 pixels, and they were instead following the rules of that instead of following what felt right. And sometimes 7 pixels is right. Shocking. And so like we deliberately didn't build some of those foundational tools to intentionally leave people in the lurch a bit. And the same with text styles. So like we don't have heading styles. We don't have any of the effects that Figma has. We don't use any sort of type styles there, just to kind of let people explore a little bit and then let the engineers push back on that, which they do.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
That's awesome. Thanks, Tim. Let's see, we've got a few other questions here. Berlin, I'll invite Berlin up as a question.
Wow.
Yeah. Hey, Berlin, welcome.
Oh, yeah. Hey, guys. Thanks for that. That was really awesome. I asked a question just before you went through your principles of documentation, making it obvious, easy, and in-depth. So apologies if this is a bit of a repeat, but I'd love to hear your answer to it. So I work with Ash, who's also in the crowd, on our design system at Belong, and we're at a really interesting intersection when it comes to documentation, especially about guidelines. I work as a UX designer, and guidelines help us not misuse components. So really keen to hear at HSDS
Yeah.
how guidelines are treated. I saw there were a few guidelines in Storybook, but just really keen to hear how you guys document them in a lean way.
Yeah. So the documentation for HSDS is largely based around what you can do with a component, how you can exploit it, rather than rules. So because we're small and because we have a lot of shared knowledge and because we're deliberately loose with the components, we allow people to interpret them as they want to. So if they want to put an accordion within an accordion, that's not great UX, but there's nothing to stop them from doing that. So there's no sort of do's and don'ts. And so instead, the documentation is largely based around here's the component, here's the different ways that it expands and collapses and colors and states and whatnot, but it definitely doesn't have any hard and fast rules. And that's been really popular, been really sort of useful with us. And also, like I said, the most useful thing is showing examples of how it's being used in the product. I think so much of a design system is contextual. So looking at a drop down doesn't really mean anything unless I can see that it has children and it has when it overflows, how it overflows. And so that's definitely been something which has been difficult to keep a hold of is the product is so big. How can I accurately show that this is used in this area over here, it's used over here, so documenting that has been really important for us. And so the documentation in Storybook has largely just been around, here are the properties that exist, and here are the different ways that you can kind of override this. You can have an icon if you want to, but you can have an icon, on the right if you need to as well. So just kind of giving people some freedom. But I liked to think of it I used to do a bit of development with Stripe's API. I don't know if you're familiar with their API docs, but they're really cool. Basically, it's you can implement a credit card form on your website with a bit of code, and you can view their API docs. And then it's here are the 50 different properties that you can add to the API that change it somehow. And it's really fun to kind of go through that as someone who has no idea about engineering and just mess with it. And I wanted that same vibe with the design system where designers felt like they could just build upon these components rather than saying, oh, this doesn't work for me, and then just creating something completely bespoke.
Oh, that's great. Thanks. It speaks a lot to your principle earlier about a system enabling creativity rather than being strict rules in HSDS.
Yeah.
Cool.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Berlin. Got another couple of questions here. Let's see. Just see if they'll come up onto the screen.
Someone said they like the check marks. You can steal anything you want. It's all stolen anyway.
Here we go. Hey, welcome, James.
Hey, can you hear me, guys?
Sure can.
Hey.
Hey, Buzz. Nice to see you again. Great talk. I just wanted to ask a little bit more about how you've broken up, I guess, the different parts of your design system. I guess branding and how branding kind of sits, I imagine, sits across them all. Then you've got iOS and Android, and I guess you've got different kind of systems amongst those. And then you've got marketing. So I want to understand a bit more about how you came to that structure and how that's working for the wider business, I guess.
Yeah, so that's actually something which has changed quite a bit since we created this. So the first thing that the first reason this came about was that when you have a big sort of a UI library that encompasses marketing stuff and product stuff, people become terrified to touch it. And this is especially the case in Sketch, because with Sketch, we had this whole system where it was on GitHub, and every time you changed the system, you had to commit it. It was pre-Figma, and people were terrified of it. So they weren't adding stuff, and they didn't feel like they belonged there. And the marketing team, who were like always inventing new stuff for landing pages, felt like they were like, interrupting the product team if they were adding new buttons and stuff. And even worse was if we wanted to use like a button in the product, we have a primary button, but also the marketing team have a slightly different primary button that looks kind of the same, but it's got a different font and it's slightly higher. So there was all this this weird overlap. So that's why we ended up creating the separate libraries. So largely it's just down to like enabling people to focus on the area of the business that relates to them, rather than creating like this big monolith. And so like we also made some mistakes along the way as well of like splitting it too small. So I had a separate library for embeddable tools, even though it looked the same, but it was like we had an embeddables library and then we had the product library. And that became a bit tricky as well because we had lots of components that were the same in the embeddables as they were in the products. And so the rule there is largely like if things look similar, or at least if they share similar properties, they should exist in the same library. But the litmus here, I think, is whether you can turn a library on and off and like not have to mess around with that setting too much. But I think generally the thing that's worked for us really well is like having that core library that I showed, which has like lots of tools and stuff. Like, at the top of every page in Figma has that like the rubric name and the links and the owner and the verified tick and whatnot. That's a good example of a component that is shared. It's useful to everybody. We have like the sticky notes. We have like brand stuff, anything that just won't change. And illustrations as well is like really useful to have that shared across all the systems. Yep. So basically everybody has core turned on and then they can just turn on whatever interests them.
Yep. And do you have a designer for each of those, I guess for like iOS, Android? Is there a designer focused for marketing or is it?
Yeah, so there's 4 designers who are in the products org. And so we contribute to products mostly. And there's 4 designers who work in the marketing department. So they mostly contribute to the marketing stuff. But one of the product designers does mostly the iOS stuff, and so he kind of looks after the iOS libraries. So it depends. People get involved in whatever libraries they want, really. So there's no real ownership. Everyone just kind of adds what they need to. As long as the structure is followed, I don't really care.
Cool. Thanks, Buzz. Thanks, Mano.
Sorry, I was smiling because I know James pretty well, and just like I saw his face, he was smiling. But...
All right, I'll leave it up to you, my man. Later.
Thanks, James.
Hey Buzz, I think great talk. I love the way you just highlight in whatever half an hour all the process of the things you've done. And I'm a bit more curious about to learn your actual outcome that came out of the design system. So you build a lot of things, the team was together for X amount of time, it's now live. What's the actual outcome you achieved or delivered?
So the outcome, well, I think the outcome is better because of the design system, because we get to stress the details like a little bit more. The outcome is the same largely as it always has been. Like visually it looks the same. Like it's maybe a little bit more polished than it used to be, but like behind the scenes we have all this componentization, so we can improve small things. Like one of the things that I think when I talked about the settings, where that was like we had this divergence. One of the things that I wanted to do was I just wanted to change the transition between like focused and normal state of an input, and I wanted to like really make that feel really nice. And the fact that we can now do that at like a really, really small level, and that goes into the design system and that then rolls out across the entire system, means that we can kind of like have a bit more control over like the subtle details. And so I think the output is a bit more dialed because of that. But you just reminded me as well of like one of the things that's kind of pains me a little bit, and I think this will always be a bit of a pain point, is that when something has that verified check in Figma, it has to be visually exactly the same as its Storybook counterpart. So Storybook is like the source of truth. And so when stuff is built and there's like a few indiscrepancies, like there's a few pixels wrong here and there, or the owner of that component then has to go back into Figma and update it. So some of those components have like, 5 pixels on the left and like, 7 pixels between elements, just because of how like the code is rendered versus how Figma has the text boxes and stuff. So it hurts me a little bit to create components that are like not fixed. I think that's kind of like an important part of having that that parity between the two.
Yeah, did you see an improvement in terms of collaboration amongst designers, and also from a product point of view? You managed to deliver like a solution quicker or different way compared to the past?
Yeah, so we're definitely moving a lot faster now. Like that was part of the slides that I missed out on, was like the value to the leadership team and to the business is that it's kind of, you get these compounding benefits. The fact that when you first create the component, it takes a ton of time to get this seemingly simple thing done. But then the next time you use it, that engineer just comes in and pastes that code in, and it's a lot easier. And then the next time they use it, it's easier still. And so like we're definitely starting to see the benefit of that reuse for sure. And I think as well, it helps that design engineer relationship as well. And that engineers aren't messing around recreating something that already exists. Like so often I get really frustrated when I'm like, nudge that 1 pixel, make that like slightly darker, like that relationship you have with the front ender that they hate and you hate. We don't really have much of that anymore. So once we have a component built and it's got parity, then we're good with that. And that kind of makes that relationship better. It means we don't have to talk about the minutiae, and instead we can talk about the experience and like improving the overall like sort of journey. And that's definitely been so useful to us.
Cool, thank you.
Cheers, man.
Awesome. I think we had one other question, but I think they've logged off. I might save it if I can ask the last question, Buzz, just around contribution. Have you found designers contributing components that don't exist, or making improvements that are not in a dedicated sort of design system team? Have you found any success in that?
Basically, people are contributing all the time, and I think that's been a real sort of show of the success of the system, is that they feel like they can do that. The real trick is to make sure that people aren't contributing too much or contributing too much of the wrong stuff. And so the bit that I kind of glossed over was when we created this system, I kind of needed everybody to just like chuck all the symbols and stuff they had from various places, just put it all in this design files in Figma, but also the same in React. So all the engineers are just chucking their code in Storybook. And we had a point where maybe 8 months ago, Figma and Storybook were just mayhem, like loads of different components all over the place. People were contributing, but like a little bit too much, and there wasn't as much structure as there needed to be. And it was even worse on the engineering side, because like naming is hard. So like engineers naming stuff like drop down version 1 and drop down version 2, drop down with fuzzy borders. And so so whilst it's been really good to have like people contributing left and right, the thing that's been really important is to kind of have that structure, hence the headers and the parent symbol and the names and the descriptors and stuff. So we've got some contribution guidelines in our like internal wiki of how to do that. But people still feel pretty empowered to do that. And I think there's a bit of a learning curve as well in like how you go through that process of creating local symbols in your Figma files, and then kind of having the sensibilities to go back and then move those to HSDS. It's a bit of a pain, but it's worked out pretty well so far. I think just the concept of ownership is nice as well. Like all the components that I showed you have my face on it, but a great number of them have other people's faces that they feel like they're babies. So that's really useful, I think. So I want to keep this as open as possible for as long as possible. Because otherwise we get into a scenario where like I have to vet everything, and I already have shit to do. So I definitely don't need that position just yet.
Yeah, awesome. Oh, sorry. Okay, one half a last question, and then I'll let you go. In terms of distribution, obviously Figma has a great library system to distribute it. Do you find people using that library system, or do they more come in to that sort of master file and copy and paste the components out of there rather than accessing them from the official library?
So I would say that most people don't use that official library. They will come in through either the guides or by using other like in-process projects. So if I'm working on a settings page or something, I know that like Nikki's been working on a settings page, I'll go into one of her files, I'll copy, paste it into my doc. So even I won't use those master components, but they are embedded within Storybook. And so that's where they're the most useful. So the engineers can kind of see where it's all referenced. So I would say those example uses are the most important. So people don't really mess around in those files, like not as much as I thought they would do at least.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Well, I'm conscious of time. We'll wrap it up there. I'm sure we could chat for hours. There's so many hidden treasures in there. So thanks again for sharing your story. That was really amazing. I'm sure there's plenty of other people that will be reaching out on Twitter and the channels. Yeah, thanks, Buzz. That was awesome.
My pleasure. Yeah, and likewise, like if there's anything that's I can share, or if you want to see some files, if you want access to this, I'm more than happy to share some information and go deeper. Like just hit me on Twitter.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Buzz. I've got a couple more slides here, and we can wrap things up. I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right. So that was Buzz sharing his awesome story. Yeah, so you can check us out on designops.lol. You can go and see some of the previous talks on there and interviews and sort of other things, all DesignOps. So yeah, if you haven't already, please go on and check that one out. You can find our Melbourne chapter on Instagram, designops_mel. Of course, designops_lol for the Twitter handle. And yeah, if you want to continue this conversation, designops.lol/Slack, come and chat in there and continue on the awesome conversations. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and have a great day. See you next time.